On the morning of April 16, 2014, a large ferry carrying over 400 people slowly tilted and began to sink off the southern coast of South Korea, and within a matter of hours, the ship would be almost completely submerged. On board, most of the passengers were high school students on a school trip to Jeju, an island just 60 miles south of mainland South Korea. As the vessel went down, many of them obeyed the instructions from the ship's crew to stay in their cabins and wait for rescue. But that rescue never came. The Sewol Ferry was originally built in Japan in 1994 and operated there under the name Naminui. After nearly 2 decades of service as a transport ship, it was sold to a South Korean company, Chunhaejin Marine, in 2012. Before being put into operation in Korea, the ship was modified to increase the passenger capacity. These changes made the ferry taller and heavier, reducing its stability in rough seas, with critics later saying that these changes were poorly regulated and likely contributed towards the disaster, despite the boat's previous faultless history in Japan. Chunhaejin Marine was a family-run company with close ties to its controlling shareholder Young Byun-yun. Yu was a controversial figure, a wealthy businessman and religious leader with a history of legal trouble. His management style of the company was secretive, and safety concerns were often ignored in favour of profits. In addition to its new structural issues, the ferry was routinely overloaded in the name of money, and come the day of the disaster, it was carrying over 2,000 tons of cargo, more than 3 times the legal limits. To add to the overloaded nature of the ferry, many of the cargo containers were improperly secured, and ballast water, which helped stabilise the ship, had been removed to compensate for the excess weight. The human side of this story begins in the city of Ansan, where more than 300 second-year students from the Damwon High School boarded the Sewol for a school trip to Jeju Island. It was meant to be a time of bonding and adventure, but instead, it would become a tragedy that would define a generation. At around 8:48 in the morning on April 16th, the Sewol was travelling through the Mengod Channel, a notoriously tricky part of the sea with strong currents and narrow passages. At the helm was a third mate who had limited experience navigating the area, and the ship made a sudden, sharp turn to starboard, and moments later, it began to list. Cargo inside the ferry shifted violently, knocking the vessel further off balance. Water began to enter the lower decks, and within minutes, the ship was leaning heavily to one side, and on board, panic among the passengers began to spread. So often listening to adults when told to do something, many of the students followed the instructions broadcasted over the intercom. Some teachers urged the students to put on life jackets and wait for rescue, while others began to question the lack of visible response to come and save them. At 8:52 a.m, a crew member made the first distress call to the Jeju Vessel Traffic Services Centre, but the urgency of the situation was not communicated by the crew members on board. Maybe things could have turned out differently if the Traffic Services Centre knew there were school children on board, but as the minutes passed, the ship continued to tilt. Some crew members escaped early using lifeboats, saving only themselves, while passengers, especially those trapped in the lower decks, struggled to make sense of what was happening. By 9:30 a.m, the ferry was nearly on its side. The Coast Guard had arrived, but the coordination between rescue teams was poor. Instead of boarding the ship or directing evacuations, many responders focused on rescuing those who had jumped into the sea. The students and teachers watched on, thinking that they would be saved, but the rescuers didn't know they were inside, as no large-scale evacuation order was given. At 10:17 a.m, the Sewol was completely submerged, except for a small part of its hull. Many students had been trapped inside, and in total, 476 people had been on board, with only 172 rescued, resulting in the deaths of 304 passengers, 261 of whom were from Damwon School, 250 of whom were students. The entire sinking was broadcast live on national television, and South Koreans watched in horror as the ship slipped beneath the water. Parents of the children on board had rushed to the port of Jindo screaming and crying, as the scale of the disaster became clear with each minute that passed. The search and rescue operation very quickly turned into a recovery mission, as divers worked tirelessly to recover the bodies of passengers, crew, and importantly, the children from the wreckage. It was a painstaking and dangerous process. Some divers were injured, while others suffered psychological trauma from what they saw in the wreckage underwater. It would take weeks to recover most of the victims, and some were never found. As grief spread in the country, public anger grew, with families of the victims accusing the government of failing to act quickly. The public also accused the ferry company of negligence and deception, as it soon emerged that the ferry captain, Lee Jun-suk, had been among the first people to abandon ship. He had not been at the helm when the accident occurred, and failed to issue proper evacuation orders. Due to his actions, he was arrested, alongside several other crew members. The president of South Korea at the time, Park Geun-hye, visited the disaster site and promised full accountability. But her government's handling of the tragedy was widely criticised due to delays, misinformation, and the lack of coordination during the early rescue efforts. The captain was later convicted of gross negligence and sentenced to life in prison, and other crew members received lengthy prison terms. The owner of Chunhaejin Marine, Young Bun-yun, became a fugitive as he went on the run from the law. After a nationwide manhunt, his decomposed body was found in a field in 2014, but the cause of his death was never fully confirmed. Many struggled with the emotional weight of having lived through something their classmates had not. Some parents of the deceased turned into activists, demanding answers, reforms, and justice to make sure a day like this could never happen again. The nation entered a period of mourning as yellow ribbons became a symbol of remembrance, while memorials were held across the country. The faces of the students, young, smiling, and full of life, were printed in newspapers, displayed in subway stations, and projected on television screens in memory, and as a reminder of the school trip, which quickly turned fatal. The Sewol Ferry disaster led to sweeping changes in South Korea's maritime regulations. Safety inspections were tightened, and emergency protocols were revised accordingly. The Coast Guard, which had come under harsh criticism, was eventually disbanded and reorganised under a new agency. Public pressure also led to the passing of the Special Sewol Law, which called for an independent investigation into the disaster. This law created the Sewol Investigation Commission, although its work was hindered by political interference and a lack of resources. In 2017, a new government under President Moon Jae-in pledged to fully recover the ship. That same year, the Sewol Ferry was finally raised from the sea floor and transported to a port for investigation. Inside the wreckage, divers found personal belongings, school uniforms, and the remains of lives that were abruptly ended. Today, the memory of Sewol is preserved through museums, documentaries, and annual memorials, with April 16th being a day of remembrance. The families continue to campaign for full accountability and transparency, and the words, "We will not forget," have become a rallying cry for a generation that refuses to let the tragedy fade into silence. The story of the Sewol is about much more than a shipwreck. It is about the cost of negligence, the failure of leadership, and the unimaginable pain of losing hundreds of young lives. But it also has sparked some stories of resilience from families and survivors, and of a country determined to learn from its past. For South Koreans, this disaster was not just about what happened at sea. It was about trust, responsibility, and the unbearable grief of a nation that felt like it had failed its children.